welcome to today's DevOps.com webcast. I am Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great webinar on tap, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will be able to listen to it later on demand. Following today's presentation, we'll be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for either of our panelists who you see on screen, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can near the end of today's webinar. Okay, with that, we'll go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is Value Stream Management and the Next Decade of DevOps. This is going to be a good one, folks. Our speakers today are Steve Boone, who is Head of Product Management at HCL UrbanCode, and Brian Muskoff, who is Director at HCL UrbanCode. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Great for having us.
Great. Well, before I turn things over to you, Steve, I neglected to let the audience know that we do have a few polling questions also during today's event. So please, hopefully we can get as many folks engaged with those polls as possible. So with that, I'm going to put myself on mute, Steve, and let you take it away.
All right. Thank you so much for the introduction. I appreciate y'all joining us today. Brian, we got a really fun topic to talk about, and I think it'll be no shock to the folks here. You know, when we talk about value stream management, specifically the next decade of DevOps, you know, DevOps has solved a whole lot of problems for a lot of companies, right? And these are pretty cool, interesting perspectives to look at it on our first slide here. And when we think about some of the original problems that DevOps looks to tackle, I mean, you know, I'm a spry 36 years old now, and I can definitely remember the days of the disposable camera. And, you know, think about how we used to interact in those days, carrying around our camera, you know, taking 24, 36 odd different pictures, and then, you know, working to actually go get those developed, having to take them to a physical place. And then the whole runoff of, was it a 24-hour development shop? Could they do it in under an hour? All in all, to get them home and then have a good laugh at the various different photos that we found. And Brian, I think you and I were just hanging out with a customer a week or so ago, and they even kind of alluded to a whole nother level that I had kind of completely forgot about in the early 2000s.
Yeah, it was that move from kind of traditional film to digital, right? And you know, it is kind of like a transitional stage of you know, moving from taking it to the photo mat for development to actually just kind of having it digital, but you still had to take it off the memory card and use the USBs and so on and so forth to get those things moved around. So it still was pretty clunky and very much a batch type approach.
Yeah, that's right. And you would still have to go out and then essentially then email those to your friends and family or get them wherever you want. And, you know, today, we can just all do it from one place, right? Instead of working in large batches, we're typically working at, you know, single photos at a time, taking them, we're able to easily edit them. And I think the cool thing is then we can easily share them, right, on a number of different platforms, and we get that quick feedback that we're looking for. Was it a good photo? Has anyone actually seen the things that I've done on my exciting last vacation? And I think it's a pretty good way of kind of drawing a parallel between, you know, how we used to operate into how companies operate today, right? Previously, companies were working in large batches of code of change. Now they're working on much more smaller batches. We're able to move much more quickly and get that fast feedback that companies like. And so that's been great. But I think, and I think hopefully some of the folks on this call today will understand that we've still got a whole heck of a lot of work to do. We definitely haven't, you know, claimed victory and I think solved all of the challenges that are out there to solve. Next slide, please. Yeah. So as we look about kind of where companies have started, right, you think one of the easy approaches that companies have originally taken was, well, how do we start kind of day one, right? And a lot of folks focused on continuous integration and continuous delivery because there's a clear ROI on trying to tackle that approach, right? It was remove the bottlenecks, add some simple automation. All of a sudden, we can start having a more consistent approach to how we deliver through our different environments. And for many teams, that gave some pretty predictable results, right? They were able to reduce failures. They were able to move a little bit more quickly. I think one of the nice aspects of it is when you start adding in that automation, you're really starting to cut out kind of cost of delay, and therefore things get a little bit cheaper. And overall, though, once you start getting a little bit more predictability, you tend to get more happier folks around the office as well that can start to understand exactly how things are going to take shape. But Brian, I don't know about you, but I kind of classify this as kind of, little a agile, right? I mean, this kind of centered most focusedly on team-based efforts, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think today when we look at kind of what larger scale, more day two problems, we're starting to talk more about what I would call big A agile, right? And some of the challenges we have. How do we start scaling these best practices from individual teams and start pushing them kind of across to our larger whole organization and understanding what are the best practices, how we can scale those out, and how folks make positive decisions themselves, right? And for teams that have really embraced kind of this day two challenge of being able to push it across the organization, on the next slide, we'll start to see, they're seeing a whole lot of growth and they're getting a lot of fantastic results. One of our internal customers that we're working with now, well over 2,500 applications that they've onboarded and have been able to automate, over 4,000 different components. And if you think about being able to add new apps with ease, right? Once you can actually build out a sustainable framework and start to drive customers to it, you can easily get 500 some apps per month. You can start pushing, hundreds of thousands of versions across many different deployment targets. And for our customers that have really embraced that, they're starting to see a lot of positive results, not just internally, but I think if you look specifically at the companies that are investing heavily in DevOps, they're turning pretty good profit on Wall Street as well. What do you think, Brian?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, kind of these IT optimizations are great. We love to see it as kind of technologists, but ultimately businesses are looking to increase revenue or decrease cost or reduce risk, and want to see that hit the bottom line, hit Wall Street, right? And if we go all the way back to Nicole's, assessment back in 2014, she had found even 5 years ago that companies that were making these types of investments were 50% higher, market capitalization growth compared to those that were not. And even 5 years later, in the most recent Accelerate State of DevOps report, it's actually growing. There's more separation between the low performers and the high performers, twice as much. And one of our colleagues, Eric Minnick, over with the IBM team, he did a really fascinating study over the last couple of years. He actually took some of his retirement investments and invested in companies that were very public about their investments in DevOps. And you can see his blue line. The blue line there is his DevOps index, and the orangish line is the S&P. And I think there'd be a lot of investment analysts out there that would love to have these types of results. I think it was somewhere in the neighborhood of a 5-year, a 5-point increase above and beyond the index, which just is a really cool way to kind of look at the whole space and the way that we're getting the ROI out of DevOps.
Yeah, it really is creative.
Yeah, it's great work by Eric, and we may have, he may be ready to retire here at this rate, but let's hope not. At the same time, the Scaled Agile team had a very interesting survey over at a European conference earlier this year, and they basically just asked the attendees at the conference to self-assess their maturity across a number of different, we can classify them as Agile and DevOps capabilities. And what you can see is it's still early days. Agile, which, really is entering its probably third decade, it's safe to say at this point, is probably furthest along. Next up is, some of the traditional kind of CI/CD automation that you hit on early, but much of the more modern practices around lean agile and really kind of end-to-end, we'll call it value stream management. It's early days for these organizations. And so, one of the things I thought would be kind of fun to do, I see we've got about 90 folks on the line here, is to run a poll. Let's take our own survey here and see where this team's at.
Yeah, sure. We can go ahead and launch a poll for folks right now. It should be popping up right there on your screen. How would you classify your team's DevOps maturity? So go ahead and make your responses. You can select from crawl, walk, run, or fly. And we'll give you guys a couple seconds here to go ahead and get your responses in. And while we are waiting for everybody to do that, I do want to remind the audience that today's event is being recorded, but also we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during the presentation, you seriously do not have to wait until the Q&A session to get your question in. So just use your GoToWebinar control panel and do that. And then, like I said before, we'll do Q&A near the end of today's webinar. Hopefully we'll get to everybody's questions. Okay, we've got more than half of folks who have voted, so I'm going to go ahead and close out today's poll. We'll take a look at the results. Okay, the results, well, it looks like the majority of folks are walking, which I think is pretty much in line with what your slides showed. Am I right?
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. I guess large numbers or whatnot, almost identical results with the Scaled Agile survey. The bulk of folks are in that crawl and walk space, and fewer ahead of the curve, which is great. That's, I think, in line with what we're seeing with our customers as well. And so I guess the question is, many of these capabilities, these concepts are not necessarily new. So why are we struggling to, adopt them? And, as we start to break down, the dynamics going on here, one of them is, there's at least, it's a multidimensional issue. In this case, we broke it down into 3 different dimensions. We've got architecture, infrastructure, and ways of working changes going on simultaneously. And so kind of just working around those items, on an architecture standpoint, over the last 15, 20 years, we've had a number of advances in terms of how we think about the architecture, of course, moving from a monolith to distributed, and then into the SOA and now microservices types architectures, and building more independent services that lend themselves to, smaller batches and faster movement. On the infrastructure side of the house, of course, we've moved from physical servers to VMs and now to cloud. And then, on the ways of working side, waterfall to agile to DevOps. And so, if you look at a larger organization, folks that are kind of leading these different changes, there's usually more than one. And so you may have one director, one vice president working on architecture, another one on infrastructure, another one on ways of working. And so in their silos, it may seem like there's only one degree of change going on, but really when you sum that up as an enterprise, there's 3 degrees of change going on. It's a very complex environment. And something like the term digital transformation, it means different things to different people, but in our space, this is really how we're thinking about it. It's many transformations at once, trying to figure out how we can align these to create business value. And then, it creates a lot of organizational anxiety, conflicts across these different areas of change. And so, Steve, this seems like it just is presenting a whole new level of challenge in the DevOps area.
Yeah, it really is. What's funny about it is I love this slide because I think this slide, it's got so many different layers to it. And when you kind of start peeling them back, you think about all the different, architectural transformations, technology transformations. When in a large enterprise, think about the many different lines of business and how often those different lines of business tend to work independently from each other. They might have their own different approaches to solving some of these DevOps challenges. So, if your vertical largely is IT infrastructure, the tools and the things that you might, usually, let's say, lean towards, it could be completely different than the folks that are, doing app dev or the folks that are in charge of provisioning. And so you've got all of these different transformations, technologies moving at once. And I think when you start thinking about it at the enterprise level, it's enough to make you a little bit dizzy. And we're starting to see our customers come to us with new challenges, right? It's not just about, hey, how can I go automate my application and do some deployments, or how can I tie into automated testing? Folks have largely solved those problems one way or another. The newer challenges, what we like to think of as day two challenges, are a lot different, right? Folks are saying, hey, we've invested a ton of money in DevOps. How do we make sure that the automation and the work that we're doing is aligned to our core business strategy, right? So how can I get visibility into what these teams are doing now that they're moving in an effective, predictable, high rate of speed? What is it actually that they're working on? And is it tied to the business goals that we're trying to deliver? And I think when we start looking at some of the other things there, it's like, hey, how do we start scaling this across the entire enterprise, right? So some teams are probably a little bit better at doing DevOps and having better best practices than others. How do we learn from those teams? What are they doing both from a people and process perspective, also a tooling perspective that's making them, let's say, more successful than what would be similar teams, right? If we're a Java organization, it's probably not uncommon to have a couple hundred different Java applications. Why are some teams a little bit better at what they're doing than others? And it's not about pointing a finger and saying shame on you, but it's about being able to share those best practices across the organization and really educate others on how to be responsible and how to be good software students within the organization. And then the other challenge is we've got decades of technology, right? Yes, some of these newer architectures are making it easier for us to kind of migrate to them and kind of tackle some of the configuration challenges that we've had in the past. But we still have plenty of folks out there with distributed applications. We have a ton of folks out there that are looking to bring mainframe into the fold, right? And so as an enterprise, how do I start managing all of these different technologies under one roof? And how do I make sure that I don't have different modes of automation for each of them? And one of the challenges that we constantly have, even as customers are re-architecting applications, is you've got some things that might be, traditional distributed components that want to be deployed. You've still got databases you want to manage. You have things that might be cloud native that kind of relate or are dependent on those other pieces. So how do we do and live in a hybrid environment without having to have multiple modes of automation and still try to have kind of that single pane of glass? And then there's the key things that people are still banging the drum on, right? Shifting left, making sure that as we start to pull in things like better quality testing, more monitoring and security, how do we find those earlier in the process? How are we making sure that we're testing earlier? Overall, just kind of having best practices and finding our defects early in the process as possible, right? I still think that's a key thing that folks want and need help with. But I think the thing is they're not looking at it as, hey, we've got some automated tests and we know when they succeed or when they fail. But how do I get intelligent about this data? How can I use it to my advantage to help me be a little bit more predictable in what we're delivering and set myself up for not only just sustainability, but comfort knowing that the things that we're doing are in fact working for the organization. And so we've had to get creative, right? I mean, when we start looking around and kind of coaching folks and talking through their different processes, and we've really come up with three kind of key ways in which we're trying to address these day two challenges. Okay? The first one is, we've got to run IT like a business, right? And what we mean by that is we need to be able to measure the investment of what we're putting into it. So if we're buying tools or if we're spending money on training or we're trying different approaches, right? All of those things take time and effort, and we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing. So if we're moving from, let's say, a 2-week sprint to a 1-week sprint as a development organization, is that doing well for us or is it not? How would we know, right? If we want to, go out and invest in microservices and start re-architecting applications, okay, that takes time and money, but we can do it. What was the return on that investment? Are we actually able to deliver these applications more quickly? Is the cost of running them within our networks more affordable? Those are the types of things that the customers are starting to say, hey, we've got a lot of options here. What is the best way for us to go? And one of the key things, I really like this bullet point, and Brian, I'd be interested to hear your thought on it. culture each strategy for breakfast, right? I mean, I think even internally from our own workings with our teams, we know, right? If we can pull in all the coolest technology in the world, but if we don't have the right folks aligned and kind of buying into what we're doing, it's kind of all for naught.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've all read the books and read the blogs and tweets from the unicorns, and yeah, there's definitely that, back to the survey, kind of that state of running and flying. But I think what we're seeing from our customers, and we're mostly working with, say, the Fortune 500, the larger enterprises, this is kind of the real world, right? There is very complex challenges out there, and it's a constant kind of evolution of improvement. But the other thing that kind of stood out to me too there when you're going through that, Steve, was, I'd say 5 years ago or so, it was pipelines. And for the most part, that's a solved problem, right? And this is where we're seeing, the industry start to move towards solving these more business-oriented problems. And culture is right in the heart of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you said it best, right? I mean, pipelines, and that's kind of the thing that I think we see customers struggling with too. I mean, the fact of the matter is now you kind of have pipeline sprawl. There are pipelines in pretty much everything you're working with. If you're running build automation in Jenkins, you've got pipelines. If you're using GitLab, you've got pipelines. Azure DevOps, multiple pipelines. There could be pipelines for infrastructure. I mean, any way that you can think about driving a workflow engine, you're essentially associating it to some pipeline, and that pipeline is giving you some bit of value. And keeping in mind with that culture theme, right, we want to make sure we're giving our development teams, our app dev teams, the freedom to go say, hey, use the technologies you're comfortable with. And in a lot of the cases, that kind of creates what we've seen as this, pipeline sprawl. Right. So how can we start to get a handle on all of the different pipelines we have, get visibility across those pipelines, orchestrate across those pipelines where need be, and at the same time still have this kind of self-service notion of release coordination and release management. Whereas previously a single team might have one pipeline to drive their application. If they're dealing in microservices, now all of a sudden they might have 50, 60, 100 different pipelines that correlate to those microservices. And on release day, they don't want to be going and driving 100 different pipelines. They want to be able to push a single button, deliver all of that automation at one go, and still have the checks and balances in place that the organization requires when delivered into production. So that becomes challenging, right? And we talked about kind of the mainframe to VM to containers. That same idea, right? As you're pulling all these technologies into pipelines, how do we bring them into one place? And I really think that's where we get into the kind of heart of our discussion today, right? Well, it's like if you're going to try to solve a lot of these problems, you really need to start optimizing your value stream. And I think the way you really start to do that is by having better visibility, right? We need to really get down into understanding what is the value that we're trying to deliver for our customers. How do we track that value, and how does it propagate through our enterprise? We think about kind of the retrospectives we have as development teams, kind of capturing our feedback, putting it back into our processes. Same thing with our ideas and things that we're delivering to our customers, right? As we propagate new ideas into our backlog, all of those good ideas, that represents business value. And how do we get that value out the door into our customers' hands as fast as possible? And so you're starting to see folks really key in on starting to want to track the various work items along with their deployment, right? And that's something that I think teams have struggled with for years. They've come up with creative ways to try to manage that. But once we can actually start looking at how these ideas propagate, we can actually start looking at some really cool, effective metrics around how long it takes for ideas to turn into business value. And it aligns back to that first point of running IT like a business, right? How do we know if what our teams are working on are the correct things, right? Do we have a way of essentially going back and auditing the different amounts of work that are getting done, so that as we want to roll up to management and have those important conversations, which, hey, can we get this feature in? If not, when do we think it'll be done? Where is it getting held up? Today we can have those conversations kind of at a pretty broad level. We can say, well, it's in QA. Well, what's in QA? The release, the work item, the epic. what exactly is the things that we're waiting on. And so that kind of granularity, I think, will really kind of key off into where we want to be going forward. And I think these types of pillars are starting to kind of change how teams are thinking about software delivery. What say you, Brian?
Yeah, no, that's perfect, Steve. And of course, the title of our talk was Value Stream Management and the Next Decade of DevOps. So I thought it was only appropriate to, put in a kind of a timeline slide, right? And I started my career in the mid '90s and was a PMP certified project manager, and well, of course, so I was kind of raised on the traditional, the early stage of this chart here. Of course, about 20 years ago, Agile, I remember when we first started introducing XP, it was 2001, 2002, we were starting to experiment with that, and it really changed everything in terms of the way that we thought about software delivery. And then, of course, in 2009, this term DevOps emerged, and I like to say continuous everything, but there's a whole set of practices that come with DevOps, and part of that is this notion of a CALMS acronym. And for those not familiar with CALMS, CALMS stands for Culture, Automation, Lean Process, Measurements, and Sharing. And I think it really does a great job of encompassing, the principles, almost like the 12 points of the manifesto or whatnot for Agile. CALMS does a nice job of summarizing really the intent of DevOps. But I think, it's safe to say that we've got more work to do to, reach that aspiration of the CALMS acronym. And really that's where we're seeing the fundamental shift. And, we weren't bold enough to give it its own label. We just labeled it Next Gen. We've referenced it, in our UrbanCode organization as DevOps Day 2. My suspicion is there probably is a new label. Maybe that is value stream management, but we see a fundamental shift going on. And, a lot of it's rooted in data and, say AI or machine learning, making use of that data to, have actionable insights and actually improve the process based on those findings. That's really about kind of looking at the system as a whole, which, lends itself to, the view of the value stream. You think about, well, what is value stream management? The way we look at kind of the evolution of the industry is all of these things kind of build on each other. DevOps builds on Agile. What's DevOps? DevOps is a encapsulation of a number of different processes and techniques: continuous integration, continuous delivery, continuous testing, application security for that matter. And so when we look at value stream management, it's really expanding, the starting point and the ending point of the way we look at software delivery, upstream and downstream, and trying to figure out a way to, improve or streamline a continuous controlled flow of value to the market. Steve, when you think about value stream management, how do you define it?
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of ways to look at it, and I think one of the cool things about value stream management, when you think about a definition for it, I really look at it is helping people or enabling people to be responsible for making the right choices day to day, right? And that just comes on how we culturally, how we form and storm and communicate, but providing better visibility. It's someone who comes out of a development manager background and worked with a number of different teams. We very easily fall into this routine of thinking about what our job is, right? And all our job is, well, it's pulling the things, prioritizing the backlog, pointing and planning, writing the code, and pushing it out. Well, that's our team's job, but we lose sight of the role our team plays within the larger organization, especially in the enterprise where you're just one group, one team, part of a larger, software package that's tied to a line of business. And again, when there's dozens of lines of businesses, it's really hard to see how a small delay or a small hiccup in your team can really impact everybody else. And so I look at value stream is educating all of the people, right? We keep saying if we're going to do DevOps, we need buy-in from the entire enterprise. Well, that's just it. The only people really buying in right now is IT. We're doing the automation, we're doing the provisioning. How do we get the rest of the business to understand that we're dependent on them, right? If we want to move quicker, they need better visibility into what we're doing. We need better visibility into what they're doing. And that's how I kind of think of a value stream, right? Like not everybody's as optimized as our IT organizations and our app dev teams.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, it's really the whole notion of continuous improvement. How do we extend that, beyond the dev team to include the business owners and the operations engineers, and it's almost kind of that meta retrospective kind of concept, but do it on an ongoing basis, just part of the system. Good. Yeah, one of the best talks that I've seen over the last year was from Jonathan Smart out at the DevOps Enterprise Summit in London, and I encourage you to take a look at his talk. But a great visual he had is the one that I'm sharing here. When we think about Agile and the benefits that Agile brought to, kind of speed and quality of delivery, it was really kind of narrowly focused in the dev community, or in the dev kind of phase of the life cycle. And really when you kind of zoom out from your dev role, you start to realize, hey, it's great that we can deliver that feature in a 2-week sprint or a couple of sprints or whatnot. But when you look at when that idea kind of enters the funnel to the time that it's actually coming out the other end, it turns out, we're only optimizing one narrow part of that overall value stream. And, it kind of segues into, our focus as a UrbanCode organization for really the last 15 years has been on that fairly dev-centric, space. Where deliverables were coming out of development, but they were kind of bottlenecking, after build, or once we kind of got past the CI challenge and solved that problem, then we moved into more of a CD type problem. How do we get it from a build and test environment all the way up through production? And as Steve kind of led off the presentation today, in large part those CI/CD problems are starting to become solved. And so then the question is, what's next? And it ties back into this broader kind of value stream and this concept of cost of delay. And so if you start to break down, the different processes going on from start to finish, you start to realize there's a lot of wait states in the end-to-end process. And certainly some of them are in development. We found, for example, code review step of the process often is an area of delay. But really where some of the lower hanging fruit is on the upstream, some of the planning, business and design activities, and then on the right-hand side still getting those items all the way through a production release.
Yeah,
so,
I think that's
Steve,
right. I mean, yeah, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, I was going to say, when you start to break down that problem and surface where those delays are, it's not as easy as it sounds.
No, it's really challenging, and I think we get back to this idea of visibility, right? I mean, how do we know where the holdup is? And there's several different tools that we use day in and day out where this data is just scattered everywhere, right? If you think about what our application teams are using, a lot of our teams live and breathe in Jira, right? And they've got great visuals to understand what's in their backlog, what they're planning with, where that goes. We've got data that is, in our CVCD tools that show us, hey, here's the build we put in the pipeline, or here's the deployment that's sitting in this environment. And for years, I think this has been a pretty good model. It's helped us not only from an automation perspective, but then it's also helped us answer some more difficult questions like what version of my code is sitting in this environment. But it hasn't really answered, I think, any of the more deeper rooted questions that people have today, which is, should I even release this code, right? Is it quality enough? And it doesn't really provide any insight into where are we slow, right? And this is where we get a lot of finger pointing within organizations, and things become kind of acquisition, right? People will say, well, I think we have an issue with QA, right? We need to improve in our testing, or we wait a whole lot of time for designs to come out of design before they get back over to development. And it's a lot of I think, right? And it's not a lot of I know. And it's not that we're completely off base. I think if you spend enough time at a company, you probably have a pretty good hunch on where things are at. But you can't get people to change their ways on a hunch, right? I'm not going to go over and say, hey, I have a feeling you need to do a little bit better job, or I have a feeling that you can improve this process. If we can actually show people where some of the slowness is and actually communicate with data the kind of challenges we have, all of a sudden, you'd be surprised how fast people want to kind of rally around and say, hey, we can do better than that. I have an idea there. And all of a sudden it becomes more of an opt-in instead of a drag people in into the solutions that you're trying to solve. And people have been trying to do this. Right? There's been a huge move of companies trying to build solutions to visualize what it is and where it is that they're spending their time, right? So we've seen people build dashboards left and right. And I think as you kind of look out into the marketplace, there's a number of different places out there where dashboards are becoming extremely popular, right? There's a lot of very well-known open source ones that people are pulling down. And these dashboards show pretty good stuff, right? They'll give you things about deployments and how many deployments you've got. They'll give you things about what was the success and failure of those deployments. How many builds are you doing? And those are really good metrics to have, right? We want to trend those results. Every team wants to see improvement in those areas. But the reality is that data is nothing without the relationships of the various different tooling that goes along with them. So yeah, you know what? Deployments are really cool. It's good to know that we're doing more deployments. But what is the quality of our deployments? And where would we find that information? Well, we want to go look at our testing tools and be able to say, hey, what were our test results from, let's say our functional test or our virtual test or our smoke test, regression test. We'd have to go to many different places to get that. If we wanted to check out, what are our security cams? Where's our static analysis? Again, we have to go a couple of different tools to probably go and find that. Those are probably sitting in our continuous integration tools, right? The things that we're triggering as part of our build process. If we want to see, hey, how are we doing in code review? Well, that's probably sitting somewhere closer to our Git repositories, right? Where we've got Git work items or Jira work items that we want to see people have commented on them, or have they changed state? How long are they taking? Are they in progress? Are they being worked on? Is it still in the backlog? And so once we start looking at the individual data points, yeah, we can get an idea. But if we actually start trying to weave together some relationships between this data, now we can start to have extremely meaningful conversations about the way not only individual teams work, but the way that work flows through the entire organization. And so if we kind of take a look on the next slide, you get this idea of traditional pipeline, right? We think about ideas moving into development, they get built, we store those artifacts somewhere, we try to progress them all the way into production. Now when we start looking at some of the relationships between this data, we can start saying, hey, how are we doing from a planning perspective, right? How long does it take for our teams to kind of sit down, understand the requirements, internalize them, build out some stories or some epics, and then go and hand those off to our design squad so they can start understanding the business value that we're trying to deliver, the customer problems we're trying to solve. And then looking into how the development teams actually operate, right? I think that from working with a number of teams, one of the things that I've always noticed is teams inherently want to be better at what they do. And I don't think that's necessarily a development thing. I think that is across all lines of things that people are doing. Who doesn't want to get better at their job? And when you've got better information, it tells you how your team is working as a group. Then you can take those actions. It just even internally for us, Brian mentioned earlier, and we struggled a little bit on code reviews and getting those through. Well, is that just because people aren't doing them? Do we need to put more training around how to do code reviews? Do we have a work in progress problem? And that's, for us, turned out what it actually was, right? In the need for people to say, hey, I want to get this stuff done, we were not doing as many code reviews. And so we had to juggle, well, how much work can we really manage? And those code reviews are just as important as actually getting the work done, because we want to make sure that we're putting out quality work. But without looking at how many things we have in review, how many things are in progress, we would have never known that was even an issue for us, right? And then we start getting into taking the things that we're doing on an everyday basis, right? Static analysis, code coverage, smoke tests, regression tests, using that data to actually help us drive our decision making, right? It'd be one thing to say, hey, how do we feel about the quality of these things? And I can go up there and we can pull up the numbers and we can take a look at it. But shouldn't we check and see if we're trending the right way? Like, we should be able to look not just at an instance in time, but we should be able to look across the last 6 months and say, hey, quality is improving or it's not improving. And if it's not improving for this latest set of value that we're trying to deliver, maybe we should hold it back until we're more comfortable about the quality. And more we're seeing a focus on teams that are really driving home that site reliability engineer role, right? Where it's, hey, we've got our applications out there. We need to monitor those applications for any issues. We need to have ongoing security scans. So when those pop up, how long does it take for us to respond to those areas, right? Where do they show up on the development radar? How do people find out about them so they can go, hey, we've got this alert, now we need to take action. And what's our time to recovery tracking all of this, right? The way that our organizations work is pretty much tied to some type of a ticket somewhere, whether it's a work item, whether it's a change request, whether it's a approval process, or an ITIL optimization that we have. They're all running in different systems. And if we can pull that data and make those relationships, we can get a whole heck of a lot of value out of them. And Brian, I would say that these types of metrics are really starting to change the way people are thinking about what's valuable to them, right? I don't think it's just about, hey, have we done more deployments anymore? I think we're starting to see many more people ask us for more meaningful data.
Yeah, absolutely. Nicely done there, Steve. And, I've got to say personally, I really enjoy kind of the way the industry is evolving. My personal history is I was an industrial and systems engineer. So kind of by education, I studied the Toyota production system and manufacturing methods. And there's, of course, many parallels here. We basically built the line, right? The pipelines are kind of the line. And now we're instrumenting them and trying to optimize them, and the analogies are really spot on there. But one of the areas that really stuck out to me here with this slide, Steve, was around smart gating and change registration. And if you read the State of DevOps report, one of their key findings this year was that is still at the top of the list in terms of pain points for organizations. And in many ways, the change management processes are doing more harm than good because it's painful to go through. So you batch up changes, so you have to go through the process less often. But if you start to aggregate, these changes and the quality and security results, and basically have a traceability view into what's going on, you can start to automate that or just streamline it. I think of it as like a red, yellow, green. If it's a green, you just go, and there's this concept of a change registration now. You just log it. There's no kind of formal gate. You just log it and you go. Whereas if it's the red, maybe you should be asking yourself if you should be even moving forward with this, but it would escalate more to a traditional change management process. So really there's a lot of and an endless opportunity here to just continue to optimize this process. But I did want to transition over to the metrics. I did see in our question area for the webinar, there's a handful of questions around metrics, and so I wanted to dive into that a bit here before we close. Coming back to our value stream view, we've got this fundamental problem that we're pretty well tuned in the middle of the cycle, but upstream and downstream, there's still a lot of opportunity to increase speed. And when you look at it from a traditional Agile perspective, and I think the way we've really been thinking about it for, say, the last 15 or 20 years, a lot of the metrics are geared towards this middle area. Metrics like velocity and with Kanban work in progress, or with Scrum with burn down charts, so on and so forth. But really, the end gate there, the end milestone, like the goal line, I guess you could say, is dev done. But as we highlight here from the DevOps handbook, dev done doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting the business value out of it. And so what value stream management's starting to do is expand that scope from end to end. And really, it is going beyond the end. And I think we're just in the early days of, call it continuous operations, or finding ways to take that operational data, especially shortly after a deployment, production deployment, and start to use that feedback loop to inform, the new activities. But when you look at, what are those value stream metrics, lead time, cycle time are certainly at the top of that list. The way we think about the definition of lead time and cycle time is lead time is really when it's approved for development. And so it's not quite day one of the idea, but it's the time where the team says, yep, we're putting this in our backlog, and it's something that we're going to work on next. Cycle time is a little more of a narrow starting measurement, in the sense that that's actually when the developer picks it up and starts working on it. And then there's three other KPIs or metrics around value stream management. Deployments. So this is, production deployments. Throughput. So how many work items are passing into development in a given period, or into production in a given period. And then change success rates. So of those changes going into production, how many of them are going in successfully versus how many are having failures. And I think we're still in the early days of that change rate as well. Today it's a very kind of IT-focused definition. There's no reason we can't expand that to say, is the investment, say that story or that feature producing the business result that you wanted, and have that more, have that kind of define the change rates. And then, of course, there's an infinite number of kind of other ways you can cut this. We find value in what we call our phase cycle time, so you can start to hone in on, different sections of the value stream that may need optimization. And so if you tie this back into, I've referenced the State of DevOps, the Accelerate report that recently came out. They've done a nice job of defining 4 KPIs that they run a survey on, and it's a very broad survey. I think there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 20,000 respondents, or somewhere in that neighborhood. And you can see on the bottom there, year over year, there's been quite a bit of increase from into that elite category. And so there certainly is progress. At the same time, if you kind of do that math, that medium and low category is kind of staying the same. And so the shift's really been from high to elite. And so it's kind of like the rich are getting richer. At the end of the day, this is a pretty good way to think about your business in the construct of a value stream. And so, it's another good opportunity to run a poll here with the folks on the call.
Yeah, we have one more poll that we'd like to push out. Hopefully everybody will take part in it. Here we go. Do you know your team's Accelerate metrics? You can select from one of 4 choices. Yes, and they are KPIs. We have a hunch, but no hard data. No, but we want them. Or no, and they are not important to us. Go ahead and make your selection. And while we're waiting for everybody to put in their answers, I just want to remind the audience that we may have a couple minutes for question and answer. We're starting to run up to the top of the hour, but if you do have a question, please go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel. And hopefully, like I said, we'll be able to get to one or two before the top of the hour. So we have, looks like the majority of folks have voted. So I'm going to go ahead and close out this poll now, and we'll take a look at the results. All right, looks like the majority of folks have a hunch, but no hard data. So not sure if that's what you guys are hearing in the marketplace.
Yeah, I was sweating it a little bit that either everyone's going to say, "Yep, we've got it," or "No, it's not important to us." But it's good to see that it's consistent with what we're seeing out there. Is folks generally know, and in fact, if you dig into this Accelerate data, it's not hard data; it's survey data. It's kind of put your finger in the air, use your gut feel in terms of what your company's performing at or your team's performing at. The trends that we've seen is, I call it a race for data. There's teams out there or companies out there creating their own data warehouses, kind of their own business intelligence tools, but it's no small undertaking to try to aggregate this data and make sense of it. And then, of course, there's a number of vendors in the space starting to solve that problem as well. And we happen to think we've got a good idea there, and so we'll share that with you here in a minute. But I guess just to close on this metrics topic, when you think about these metrics, and look, lead time, deployments, throughput, these aren't necessarily brand new metrics, but I think in our software delivery space, they're relatively new. And I thought I'd give just a little kind of case study in terms of how we can start to use these. And so, take this first team, for example. You can see on the left, their lead time month over month improving. And so that's a good thing. You want to go faster, have less time from idea to, outcomes. In the middle there, you can see they're starting to move from monthly production releases to twice a month to 4 times a month to 8 times a month. But what's happening there? They're having more failures. As they're trying to go faster, they're having more production failures. That's not a good thing. And then on the throughput side, you can basically just think of these as issues or work items going through the system. We broke it up into 3 categories of features, defects, and tasks. You can see overall throughput's increasing, so there's more kind of volume going through the system, but the allocation is more defects and features. And so this team's going faster, but they're out of control. And it's, not, if you don't have visibility to this type of data, you may not know that your team's running out of control. You may just think you're moving faster. Take on the other, another team, for example, Team B. Similar lead time. Their lead time is, been cut in half or better over the course of the year. They're deploying more often. When they try to speed up their deployments, they may have a setback or two, but that's resolved. And then you can see their throughput is growing throughout the year, while their allocation of defects is actually shrinking. So this is the more ideal scenario where you're going faster and you're in control and your capacity is increasing. And so, Steve, when I think about our own experience here at UrbanCode, what's great about, being in this enterprise software space is we're kind of our own customer, right? And so the problems we're seeing our customers have, we've had ourselves. And ultimately, we've had to solve these problems for ourselves, and we think we've got something where we can bring it to market. And I'd like to hand it over to you to share what we've got.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll be quick going through here because I know we got some questions that we want to get to. So real quickly, as Brian alluded to, we're definitely not off the hook on any of these challenges, and basically had to go and scratch our own itch. And that's where a lot of, I believe a lot of it of the best software innovation comes from is solving a problem that your team has. And so one of the questions I believe was Raj asked in the Q&A panel was, well, how are you tracking the wait time for these different things? When we just look at very, very simply the relationships between the data. How long does it take for a work item to leave our backlog and actually have it, get into a sprint? And then once we pick that up, how long does it take for a developer to actually work on that item, right? How long does it sit in code review? There are various different stages in the tools that help you track this today. So Jira has a pretty good workflow system that you can key off of. But then we start looking at that, okay, if when a developer makes that code commit, are they, they're associating various different work items along with it. And so then we can start looking at pull requests tied to various different work items. We can start looking at builds associated to various different work items and really get that visibility into how much work is actually in progress, what things are holding it up. Our teams internally have been, using this when they come in the morning to complement stand-up and say, hey, what do we have in code review? What do we have in progress? How long has it been going on? And we can easily identify when somebody needs help. And, that's really good in today's day and age when not all the time people will feel comfortable raising their hand and say, hey, I'm stuck, right? But now the team knows exactly where that work's at, and we can easily identify it. So, Brian, if you want to maybe skip ahead towards the last slide, we can jump on and take some questions here. I know we're running up against the hour. Some really cool things that we have. There's a great way to kind of keep the history of all of the different work items we have, right? You think about work moving from that backlog into production. As it goes forward, it builds a history. It's seen things. It's been tested. It's been reviewed. It's been put through kind of the whole business challenge that we set up for it. And it's great to be able to go back in there and kind of look at the history of those work items. Think about how more effective your retros could be if you could say, hey, when we point something of this size, we've got these kind of trends that say, yeah, we can probably get this done in a week or so. Now, we don't have to say probably. We can actually put real numbers to it and say, yeah, no, it absolutely is, 9 days to deliver this. So from that perspective, the kind of power you have as a release manager, as a product owner, to be confident in telling the business, yes, we can get this done, or no, we can't get this done, and here's why. All of a sudden, everyone's got way more understanding of what's possible, right? And where we can actually make some improvement. So with that, let's go ahead and see. I know we got a couple of minutes. If we can take a couple questions, that'd be great.
Yeah, we can maybe get to one question, then we're going to have to close it out, unfortunately. But let's go ahead and take a look at one of the questions. Let's see. As different department heads are not aligned with agility, how can we get them to buy in for DevOps tools and infrastructure needs by the IT team?
Yeah, getting initial buy-in is challenging, right? I think that, again, if you can surface any kind of data, right? So depending on the problem that you think will deliver the most ROI, if you think that's deployment automation, right, then we need to show hard facts that we struggle at doing deployments. And that could be quality, it could be inconsistency, it could just be time spent waiting, right? But start to track those things in your next release. Start to track where you think those pain points are and do whatever you can to kind of put some metrics around that. And I guarantee if you go back to your management and say, this is how much time we sit and waste, or these are the amount of extra effort we need to do to try to resurface or correct these mistakes, all of a sudden that amount of time will absolutely equate to dollars, and people can go, hey, maybe it makes some sense to make some investment. Maybe it's not necessarily even in tooling. Maybe it's just in the processes that we're doing internally. Maybe there's a better way that we can work. And it's a slow grind, but I think that's going to be your best part, as to kind of surface that data to have a meaningful conversation.
Okay, great. We are at the top of the hour, so unfortunately we have to close out Q&A. If we didn't get to your question, which was most of you, unfortunately, I apologize. But please know that the folks at HCL UrbanCode will get a copy of all the questions, and I'm sure they'll be more than happy to follow up with you offline. Also want to remind the audience real quick that today's event has been recorded, so if you missed any or all of the events, you will be able to listen to it later on demand. We are sending out that email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And the webinar is also going to be living on the DevOps.com website, so you can always go find it there. Just go to DevOps.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there. Brian and Steve, thank you so much for such a great presentation, tons of great information, and also want to thank the audience for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody.